thank you, Alex. Thanks for the introduction. To introduce myself, I'm Richard Flemings, CEO and founder of Map Impact. A few words about who we are. So what we've seen, and part of the reason we founded this business, is that it's very well reported that nature is in decline, really significant decline globally. There's talk of us coming into a mass extinction event, and this having serious implications on human life as we know it. So we founded this company as part of that story, really. We believe that humans and nature can coexist if we manage things in the right way. But the most important word on this slide when I introduce who we are is collaboration. And we founded this company at the beginning of this year, and the only reason I'm here today is because we've taken a highly collaborative approach to business. And we've been able to collaborate with Landmark very, very closely to bring a new product to market. So collaboration is really at the heart of what we do. All of these issues around nature and the declines in nature and biodiversity cannot be resolved by single organisations on their own in silos. It takes a really concerted effort from everyone to really try to address some of these things. So at the heart of what we're doing is environmental legislation. That's really driven our business. That's driven us as starting our business, and that's brought us to where we are. So this goes right back to the Environment Act, which was passed in England in 2021. And within that, there were several things in the future that were put in to become mandatory. And the first of those is biodiversity net gain, which is what I'll be talking a bit more about today. This, until about 3 weeks ago, said November 2023. The English government weren't ready for November 2023, so they've pushed that back to January 2024. And what this legislation is saying in England is that every new planning development must show biodiversity net gain of 10%. So there's a lot of scrambling at the moment to understand what does biodiversity net gain actually mean? How do I prove my starting point? What's my baseline? And then how do I build that into my plans to say, well, I'm going to develop biodiversity to increase by 10%. The really interesting thing about this as well is that the legislation locks that in for 30 years. 30 years, I mean, that's huge really, in that as a developer, when I'm submitting plans for a new site, I have to say, this is what I'm going to do to show biodiversity increase. By the way, I'm going to lock that into my development plan for 30 years. So really, really interesting, and that's galvanised a lot of activity. But what we're seeing as a company, which I won't talk too much about today, but we're already looking at future products which connect into water and air. So there's lots of other environmental legislation coming, looking at mandating reporting around these additional environmental variables. And then we're seeing equivalent legislation coming in EU, but more importantly, in other parts of the UK. So at the moment, this biodiversity net gain legislation is just in England, but there is already a lot of talk about that coming into force in Scotland from next year or early the year after, and the same in Wales as well. So we're beginning to focus on those other parts of the UK, particularly on Scotland, which I'll talk about right at the end, because it's really my call to action to you all to collaborate on that. So really, what are we doing? What's our service all about? And when we sort of first looked at this and we saw the problem here, the problem is what's happening is that legislation is demanding this biodiversity net gain, and therefore it's demanding a competent professional to come and understand what's happening with biodiversity on a site. And that usually falls to an ecologist. But there's a huge issue with a number of trained ecologists that exist. And the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management have described this as a crisis in the sector. So essentially, there aren't enough ecologists in the UK, and that's before this mandatory legislation is introduced. So part of what we're doing is really to support ecologists. We're not trying to replace them. We've been tried to be really clear with our messaging. We're turning up with a new service that's a data service. It's drawing in lots of different things, but it's designed to support ecologists. It's not going to replace them. It's going to enhance what they're doing and increase efficiency. And it's really interesting hearing the talk from Paul earlier about efficiency of people, and we chatted, before the talks, and what he was saying, actually, what I want to do with new ways of doing things is not replace people, but actually make sure they're doing the job they should be doing and what they're trained to do. And I've been told by ecologists that actually only 20% of their time is actually doing ecology. The other 80% is preparing information, or it's writing reports at the end. So I figure if I can help free up more of that time, then I've done a good thing with this. If I can help to get ecologists doing more ecology work, then we've all won here. So how do I measure biodiversity? So what we have in the middle here is something we call biodiversity units. And this is a concept that's been created by DEFRA in England. And they have a thing called the Biodiversity Metric Calculator, which I don't have time to go into here. It's vast. It's an Excel spreadsheet with 30 tabs, and then there's 30 tabs to explain the first 30 tabs. So it's a bit of a beast. But at the heart of it all are these four things. So in order to understand biodiversity, you have to know what habitat you've got, and you have to know what the area of that habitat is, what's its size. You then have to know habitat distinctiveness, which is all about how rare that is. So the rarer the habitat, the higher it scores. You have to know about its strategic significance, and that could be something local that's playing into that habitat being important. And then at the bottom here, something that's really important is habitat condition. So you know the area, but how well is that particular bit of habitat performing? And that's really important. And this is the unique bit where we've created a new way of measuring that, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So another interesting thing here, this is what's called the mitigation hierarchy. So what this is all about is, again, I could spend a full half hour talking in detail about this, but I don't have time. I can talk about it to anyone who wants to get into more detail on this afterwards. But what you've got here is that these are the sort of rules that have been laid out by DEFRA in England about how you should manage biodiversity. So firstly, you should try to avoid any damage to biodiversity. That's the easiest thing to do. Then you should minimise, so reduce the extent of your impact on biodiversity. Then you should mitigate on site. So if you're developing a site, ideally you would have some biodiversity improvement on that site. And as a last resort, you should offset your biodiversity, so to compensate for loss. Now, what we're seeing is that biodiversity actually can't be enhanced on a lot of sites, particularly in urban areas. So people are being forced into the bottom part here, which is very interesting, because what we're seeing is essentially a biodiversity market spinning up. So when we look at land, when we appraise land, and with the report that we've created here, it's not just useful for understanding a site that you're planning to develop. It could also be useful to understand a site that you're planning to enhance biodiversity on. So some really sort of interesting things at play here. So what we've done is we've taken a lot of open source data, and we've used satellites as the primary driver to underpin everything that we're doing with this new service. The guiding principle of what we've done is to align with the DEFRA Biodiversity Metric Calculator, which is the 30-page Excel sheet that I've talked about, and align with a system called UKHAB. UKHAB is a habitat classification system which is currently just in England, but there's talk of that being rolled out into Scotland as well at the moment. So there's a lot of conversations amongst the ecology community about applying this system into Scotland. And what we've come up with is a rapid assessment, a screening service to understand biodiversity at the start of the process. Before I show you an example of what that looks like, I want to show you a little bit about satellites. Again, I'm going to cover some technical topics really quickly. If anyone wants to talk more about this, please come and find me afterwards. But the headline here is that there's a few myths with satellites, and I've been showing this slide a few times recently. These are a few screen grabs from Homeland or some other Hollywood series, and you see this thing where you've got a control room and someone says, I've got a bad guy, zoom the satellite in, watch what he's doing and follow him, and read the newspaper that he's reading. That doesn't really exist. It certainly doesn't exist in the commercial world. It may do in the military, but it's certainly not something that we can access. So satellites aren't constantly watching us. What they are doing is essentially rotating around the Earth, and they're doing something called following a sun-synchronous orbit. So they're constantly following the sun around the world. So it's daylight somewhere all the time. And are essentially taking photographs straight down. So what you build up is this enormous archive of photographs. And because they're going around the world in this way, and because of the patterns that they rotate around in, the satellite that we use actually visits the UK about twice a week. That doesn't mean we get images twice a week, because cloud cover here is something we have to consider as well. But within the satellites, we're, again, some technical detail here, but what we can see with our naked eye is this is the light spectrum here, the wavelengths of the light spectrum, and what we can see is actually a small part of this with the naked eye. But our satellites are actually capturing a lot more of this. They're capturing a lot of different parts, a lot of different wavelengths. And from this, we're able to understand lots of different things about vegetation. So we're able to infer different characteristics of how vegetation's performing, and that can then lead to us having an understanding of biodiversity. So what we're doing within our service is essentially taking this satellite data that's captured very frequently, and we're analysing that to understand lots of different characteristics of vegetation, which we're then using to infer biodiversity. So the service that we've launched is called Biodiversity View. Now this is actually, we've launched this today, we're beginning to really promote this, but this is what's feeding into the landmark report, which I'll show you an example of. But what we've created here is actually a nationwide, England-wide, on-demand reporting service of terrestrial biodiversity status. It's got a grid that covers all of England with an indicator of biodiversity every 50 metres. And the idea of that is that it can be there as a huge data bank which can supply all sorts of different stakeholders. The particular focus of the current report is looking at property developers and landowners to give them this very rapid understanding of what's going on with biodiversity on a site. But we're beginning to speak to lots of other potential users of this. And the interesting thing for me about this legislation is that we have one side, which is the developers who have to submit their plan that shows biodiversity net gain. We then have another side who are local authorities who have to mark the homework of developers. Local authorities are so under-resourced. It's just frightening how little resource they have inside there. And so they're really searching hard for new ways of doing things and new technology to be able to support what they're doing. So I think local authorities will be a really important user of this information as well, to help them have some understanding of their land and what people are doing on their land. So to finish, I'll just work through a few slides just to show you an example report. So it's a 4 or 5 page report. As I said, it's a very sort of rapid screening report. There's a few sort of minor errors in here, which I'm sure Alex will spot. This one's from a couple of weeks ago. So we've been constantly iterating this, ready to launch it today. So what you actually see here is what we're able to get to is an estimate of the number of biodiversity units on a site. So because we know the habitat, we can therefore understand how many biodiversity units there potentially are on this site. And we can say how many are there potentially, but how many do we have at the moment? And what we've got here is actually, this is a wildlife trust site from Gloucestershire. So it's actually quite a good quality site in terms of biodiversity. There's quite a lot here. But what you could begin to do with this is look at this and say, okay, well, my lowland meadows on this site, they're actually performing really well. So if I want to improve biodiversity, maybe that's not the place to look. Maybe I should look at my wetlands, which aren't yet performing so well. So it's beginning to give us some information that can help to understand how the site's performing and help to understand how specific habitats on that site are performing, which we can then enhance to get our biodiversity net gain. Or we can look the other way and say, you know, if we're a developer, we can say, well, this modified grassland's not performing very well. Maybe that's where we should build, because that's the part of the site we can build on and then look to develop our biodiversity elsewhere. So that's the front page, giving you that rapid understanding of what a site looks like. And we then have a description of all the habitats on the site and the distinctiveness score. And then we have what we're calling a habitat quality overview. And this is where the satellite data comes in, because what we're able to do is look at not just this site in Gloucestershire, we're able to look at this site in Gloucestershire in the context of an enormous area around. So we're able to benchmark this site and how this site is performing, how the habitats here are performing against the surrounding environment using satellite data. And that's what gives us this quality score. So we can get give someone a really rapid understanding of what's the quality looking like over their site. And again, this one's, as you would expect, it's performing well because it's a wildlife trust site. You'd like to hope it would be if they're looking after it properly. We then have some description of what's happening in here. So everything I've just described to you is summarised within here, and then we have a terms and conditions page. So that's it. We'd really like to hear feedback on this. We'd really like to have everyone come and talk to us about this. By all means, come and order these. They're available from today. So come and buy one if you've got a site of interest in England. Yeah, exactly. But before I finish, I just wanted to finish with a quote from David Attenborough. And this, I think this kind of sums things up for me. He said, this is quite a recent quote from him. I'm hopeful for the future because although nature is in crisis, now is the time for action, and together we can save it. So I'll finish there. I do have a call to action. So I know we haven't got a Q&A now, but I would say this is something I'd really like to speak to people about. We haven't yet run our data analysis over Scotland, and we'd really like to be speaking to Scottish stakeholders about what you would like. So thanks very much.